Close your eyes for a moment, my friends. Take a slow breath. Imagine cold air touching your face as you stand on a narrow path high in the mountains. The wind moves softly across the rocks. A hawk circles slowly above the valley. Far below, a river cuts through dark green forests and ancient stone. These mountains are older than any kingdom, older than any border, older even than the stories humans tell about themselves. For thousands of years, people have lived among these mountains. They built small villages on steep hillsides. They guided sheep across narrow passes. They sang songs beside winter fires while snow covered the peaks outside. These people are known today as the Kurds. More than 30 million people across the Middle East share this identity, and yet they do not have a single country of their own. Their homeland stretches across several modern nations: Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria. The mountains remain the same, but the borders changed many times. And here is the quiet mystery of their story. How does a people survive thousands of years without a single state? How does identity live when maps keep changing? Tonight, my friends, we will walk through that long story together. A story of mountains, a story of memory, and above all, a story of resilience. But to understand the Kurdish story, we must travel far back in time, much further than most people expect. Long before modern nations existed, long before the words Turkey or Iraq appeared on any map. Let us go back in time, back to the ancient highlands of the Middle East, the land between the Zagros Mountains and the Taurus Mountains. This region formed a natural bridge between great civilizations. To the west were the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. To the east lay the vast Persian plateau. To the north stretched Anatolia. And through this rugged crossroads, many empires marched. But the mountains always shaped the lives of those who lived there. The valleys were narrow. The winters were cold. The paths were difficult. This land did not easily submit to outside control. Ancient historians wrote about fierce mountain tribes who lived in these regions. One of the earliest known groups were the Maids. They lived in the highlands of what is now western Iran and eastern Kurdistan. Some historians believe the Kurdish cultural roots are closely connected to these ancient Iranian peoples. The Medes were not a small tribe. They became powerful. In the 7th century before Christ, the Medes joined forces with another rising power, the Babylonians. Together they attacked the mighty Assyrian Empire. At that time, Assyria controlled a vast region of the ancient world. Its armies were feared across the Middle East. Its cities were enormous. Its kings ruled with iron authority. But even powerful empires can fall. In 612 BCE, the Allied armies destroyed the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. The great empire collapsed. For a moment in history, the Medes stood among the most powerful forces in the region. But history moves like a river. Power never stays in one place forever. Soon another empire rose from the east, the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. The Persians absorbed the lands once ruled by the Medes. The mountains remained. The people remained. But new rulers arrived, and this pattern would repeat again and again. Empires came, empires disappeared. But the mountain communities endured. And slowly, across centuries, a cultural identity began forming among the highland peoples, an identity shaped not only by language, but also by landscape. The mountains became more than geography. They became protection. They became home. They became memory. And memory is one of the strongest forces in human history, even stronger than armies, even stronger than borders. But the story was only beginning. Because new conquerors were already approaching from the west. The year was 34 BCE. A young king from Macedonia crossed into Asia. His name was Alexander. Alexander the Great. His armies moved like a storm across the ancient world. City after city fell before him. Persian armies were defeated. Within a few years, Alexander controlled lands stretching from Greece to India, and his soldiers marched directly through the mountain regions where Kurdish ancestors lived. For the mountain tribes, the arrival of Alexander changed little at first. Empires often fought their battles in the open plains. Mountains were more difficult to conquer. After Alexander died, his vast empire broke apart. New kingdoms appeared. Greek influence spread across the Middle East. Cities filled with Greek architecture, language, and culture. Yet in the highlands, life continued in familiar ways. Shepherds guided their flocks across the slopes. Farmers worked small terraces carved into mountain hills. Tribal loyalties remained strong, and the mountains continued to protect their independence. Over the centuries, new empires arrived again. The Roman Empire expanded into the western parts of the region. The Parthian and later the Sasanian Persian empires ruled the east. For hundreds of years, these two great powers faced each other across the same mountains, Rome on one side, Persia on the other. The Kurdish highlands stood between them. This meant the region often became a frontier, a place where armies passed through, where alliances shifted, where local leaders sometimes changed loyalty depending on the political winds. But the mountain tribes adapted. They learned how to survive between powerful neighbors. They negotiated. They resisted. Sometimes they fought. Sometimes they cooperated. This flexibility became one of the keys to Kurdish survival. When the Roman Empire eventually divided into eastern and western halves, the Byzantine Empire inherited Rome's eastern lands. Once again, the mountains found themselves between two powerful worlds, Byzantium and Persia. For centuries, these two empires struggled for control of the same frontier. Fortresses were built. Armies marched. Villages sometimes suffered during these conflicts. Yet, even during war, everyday life continued. Children were born. Families gathered around fires. Songs passed from one generation to another. These songs carried language, and language carried identity. Then, in the 7th century, a new power appeared from the Arabian Peninsula. Arab Muslim armies expanded rapidly across the Middle East. Within a few decades, they defeated both the Byzantine and Persian forces in many regions. The political map changed again. But Kurdish communities adapted once more. Many Kurdish groups gradually became part of the Islamic world. They served as soldiers, traders, local leaders. Over time, Kurdish culture blended elements from Persian, Arab, and regional traditions while still maintaining its own character. During this era, one Kurdish figure would rise to extraordinary fame, a man whose name would echo across history. His story would shape how the world saw Kurdish strength and leadership. His name was Saladin, and his journey was about to begin. The desert wind moved slowly across the walls of a small city called Tikrit. It was the year 1137. The Tigris River flowed quietly beside the city, reflecting the warm light of the setting sun. Merchants closed their market stalls. Camels rested after long journeys across the desert roads. Inside this quiet city, a child was born into a Kurdish family. His name was Yusuf. History would remember him by another name, Saladin. His father served as a military officer under the rulers of the region. Like many Kurdish families at the time, they lived within the powerful political structures of the Islamic world. The Middle East during the 12th century was a place of tension and uncertainty. To the west, Christian Crusader kingdoms had been established after armies from Europe captured several cities of the Holy Land. Jerusalem was under Crusader control. Muslim rulers across the region were divided. Different dynasties competed for power. Different armies fought for influence. In this complicated world, young Yusuf grew up watching soldiers train and hearing stories of distant battles, but no one could yet imagine the role he would one day play. When Saladin was still a boy, his family moved to the city of Damascus. Damascus was one of the great cities of the Islamic world. Its markets were full of spices, silk, and travelers from distant lands. Scholars gathered in its schools. Poets wrote verses under the shade of gardens. Here, Saladin received his early education. He studied religion. He studied literature. He learned the traditions of leadership and responsibility. Yet those who knew him as a young man often described him as calm and thoughtful rather than ambitious. He was not famous for seeking power. In fact, some early stories describe him as quiet and reflective. But history often chooses unexpected people, and the world around Saladin was changing rapidly. A powerful military leader named Nur ad-Din ruled much of Syria. He dreamed of uniting Muslim lands to resist the Crusader states. Saladin entered the service of Nur ad-Din through his uncle, a skilled general named Shirkuh. Shirkuh was sent on military expeditions to Egypt, where political struggles were creating instability. Young Saladin traveled with him. The journey to Egypt would change everything. At that time, Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, but internal conflict had weakened the government. Different factions struggled for control. Foreign powers watched closely. Nur ad-Din wanted influence there. Shirkuh led several campaigns into Egypt, and Saladin observed the complex world of diplomacy, warfare, and political negotiation. When Shirkuh suddenly died in 1169, something surprising happened. Saladin was chosen to replace him. He became the new vizier of Egypt. At the time, many powerful men doubted him. He was young. He had little experience as an independent ruler. But Saladin proved them wrong. Slowly and carefully, he strengthened his authority in Egypt. He reorganized the military. He improved administration. He built alliances. And most importantly, he remained patient. Patience would become one of his greatest strengths. Over the next several years, Saladin unified Egypt and Syria under his leadership. This created a powerful new force in the region. For the first time in decades, the Muslim world in this region had a leader capable of challenging the Crusader kingdoms. But Saladin was not driven only by conquest. Historical accounts often describe him as generous and disciplined. He prayed regularly. He lived relatively simply compared with many rulers of his time. He believed strongly in justice and mercy. These qualities would shape his reputation across cultures. Then came the year 1187, one of the most important moments in medieval history. The Crusader armies marched to confront Saladin near a place called Hathaten. The land there was dry and hot, water was scarce. Saladin carefully controlled the battlefield. He cut off the Crusader army from water supplies. Exhaustion and heat weakened them. When the battle finally began, Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader army. The defeat was devastating. Within months, Saladin's armies moved toward Jerusalem. For nearly 90 years, the Crusaders had controlled the Holy City. Now Saladin stood outside its walls. The world watched closely. When Jerusalem finally surrendered, many people feared the worst. History remembered terrible massacres when Crusaders had captured the city decades earlier. But Saladin chose a different path. Instead of revenge, he allowed many inhabitants to leave peacefully after paying a ransom. Some who could not afford the ransom were freed by Saladin's own generosity. Even many of his enemies respected his decision. European writers later described him as a noble opponent. For Kurdish history, Saladin became a powerful symbol, a leader from Kurdish roots who influenced world events, a man remembered not only for victory, but also for mercy. Yet, Saladin did not create a Kurdish state. His empire remained part of the wider Islamic world. After his death in 1093, his territories were divided among his heirs. The political unity he had built gradually weakened, but his legacy remained. Stories about Saladin traveled across continents. They appeared in Arabic chronicles. They appeared in European legends. And among Kurdish communities, his memory carried a special meaning. Proof that someone from the mountains could stand among the greatest leaders of history. But the centuries ahead would not be easy for Kurdish lands, because once again, powerful empires were rising, and the mountains were about to become a frontier between two giants. The centuries after Saladin were quiet in some ways. But beneath the quiet surface, powerful forces were moving again. New empires were rising. And once more, the Kurdish mountains would stand between them. Close your eyes for a moment, my friends. Imagine a long caravan moving slowly through a mountain pass. Horses breathe white clouds into the cold air. Metal armor clinks softly as soldiers ride through the narrow valley. Above them, the mountains watch in silence. They have seen this before. They will see it again. After the time of Saladin, the Middle East entered an age of shifting dynasties and growing empires. By the 14th and 15th centuries, two powerful states were expanding toward each other. In the west, a new force rose in Anatolia, the Ottoman Empire. In the east, another powerful empire was forming, the Safavid Empire of Persia. Both empires were ambitious. Both wanted control of the same strategic lands. And those lands included the Kurdish mountains. For the Kurdish tribes living in these highlands, the situation was complicated. They were not one united nation. Instead, they were organized into many tribes and small principalities. Each tribe had its own leader. Each region had its own alliances. Some Kurdish leaders chose to support the Ottomans. Others cooperated with the Persians. Some tried to remain independent. The mountains allowed this kind of flexibility, and for a time, it worked. In 1514, a famous battle changed the political map of the region. The Battle of Calderan. The Ottoman Sultan Selim I faced the Safavid Shah Ismail. The battle was fierce. Ottoman artillery gave them a decisive advantage. The Safavid army was defeated. After this battle, the Kurdish lands were divided between the two empires. The western Kurdish regions fell under Ottoman control. The eastern regions remained under Persian influence. For Kurdish leaders, survival required careful decisions. Many Kurdish princes formed agreements with the Ottoman Empire. In exchange for loyalty, they were allowed to maintain a degree of local autonomy. This meant Kurdish rulers could still govern their own regions. They collected taxes. They maintained local armies. They preserved their cultural traditions. For several centuries, this arrangement allowed Kurdish identity to continue. Kurdish emirates existed across the mountains. Places like Botan, Soran, and Baban became centers of Kurdish leadership. These emirates were not large kingdoms, but they provided stability. They allowed Kurdish culture to grow. Poetry flourished during this time. One of the most famous Kurdish poets, Ahmad Khani, lived in the 17th century. He wrote a legendary romantic epic called Mem and Zin. The story described love, tragedy, and destiny, but beneath the surface, it carried a deeper message. Khani wrote about the Kurdish people as one nation, a nation without unity, a nation divided among powerful rulers. His words reflected a quiet sadness, but also a hope that one day the Kurdish people might stand together. Still, political reality was difficult. The Ottoman Empire remained strong, and over time, the empire began changing its policies. During the 19th century, Ottoman rulers wanted more central control. They no longer wanted powerful local princes ruling distant mountain regions. The empire began removing Kurdish autonomy. Kurdish emirates were slowly dismantled. Local rulers were replaced with officials sent from the capital. This change created tension. Several Kurdish revolts followed. One of the most significant occurred in the 1840s under Badir Khan Beg, a Kurdish prince who ruled the emirate of Botan. He tried to maintain Kurdish independence against Ottoman centralization. For a time, he succeeded. But the Ottoman military eventually defeated him. Badir Khan was forced into exile. The old system of Kurdish emirates gradually disappeared. For many Kurdish communities, this was a turning point. Without their traditional leaders, Kurdish society began entering a new political era. But even as old structures disappeared, new ideas were quietly growing. Ideas about national identity, ideas about self-rule, ideas that would become even more powerful in the century ahead. Because the Ottoman Empire itself was weakening, and when great empires weaken, the map of the world often changes. No one yet knew it, but the early 20th century would bring one of the greatest political earthquakes in Middle Eastern history, an earthquake that would reshape the fate of the Kurdish people. And it would begin with a war that consumed the entire world, the First World War. The year was 1914. Across Europe, powerful nations were preparing for war. Armies gathered. Factories produced weapons. Leaders made decisions that would soon change the fate of millions. But far away from the capitals of Europe, the mountains of Kurdistan seemed calm. Villages continued their daily life. Farmers worked the land. Shepherds guided their flocks along ancient mountain paths. Children ran between stone houses while smoke rose slowly from cooking fires. Yet the world was about to change. And when it changed, it would reach even the quietest mountain valley. The First World War began like a storm that spread across continents. Empires entered the conflict one by one. Among them was the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottoman state had ruled much of the Middle East. Its territories stretched across Anatolia, the Arab lands, and large parts of the Kurdish mountains. But the empire was already weakening. Internal problems had grown for decades. Economic troubles, political instability, pressure from rising European powers. The war placed enormous strain on the empire. Battles were fought across many fronts, in the Caucasus Mountains, in the deserts of the Middle East, along the shores of the Mediterranean, and as the war dragged on, the Ottoman state began to collapse. By 1918, the empire was defeated. Its armies were exhausted. Its government was falling apart. For the peoples living inside the empire, this moment created both fear and possibility. Because when empires fall, new countries are often born. Across the Middle East, many groups hoped for independence. Arabs hoped to create their own states. Armenians dreamed of security after centuries of suffering. And among the Kurdish people, a similar hope began to grow. For generations, Kurdish identity had survived through language, tradition, and tribal memory. But now, something new appeared. The idea of a Kurdish nation. Writers, scholars, and community leaders began discussing the possibility of self-rule. New Kurdish newspapers appeared. Political societies formed in cities like Istanbul. Kurdish intellectuals debated the future. Could the Kurdish people finally create a homeland of their own? For a brief moment in history, this dream seemed possible. In 1920, the victorious Allied powers prepared a peace agreement with the defeated Ottoman Empire. This agreement became known as the Treaty of Sèvres. Within its many pages, one section spoke directly about Kurdish lands. The treaty suggested the possibility of a Kurdish state. It proposed that Kurdish regions might eventually gain independence after a period of international supervision. For Kurdish leaders, this moment felt like the opening of a long-closed door. For centuries, Kurdish communities had lived under different empires. Now, perhaps, a Kurdish homeland might appear on the map of the world. Hope spread across the mountains. Meetings were held. Political groups formed. Discussions about borders, governance, and leadership began. But history, my friends, is rarely simple. Because another powerful movement was rising at the same time. In Anatolia, a Turkish nationalist leader named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, rejected the Treaty of Sèvres. He believed the treaty divided Turkish lands unfairly. He began organizing a new resistance movement. Turkish national forces fought against occupying armies and rejected the old imperial government. This conflict became known as the Turkish War of Independence. The struggle was intense. Battles were fought across Anatolia. Cities changed hands. Diplomatic negotiations continued behind closed doors. Eventually, the nationalist forces succeeded. In 1923, a new agreement replaced the earlier treaty. This agreement became the Treaty of Lausanne, and with that new treaty, the promise of a Kurdish state quietly disappeared. The new borders recognized the Republic of Turkey. Kurdish regions were divided among several countries: Turkey, Iraq, which was under British influence at the time, Syria, controlled by the French, and Iran, which had its own long history and government. The Kurdish homeland had not disappeared, but it had been divided by international borders. Families suddenly lived in different countries. Tribal lands were separated. Communities that once shared the same mountains found themselves under different governments. For many Kurdish people, the dream of independence seemed to slip away just as it had begun to appear. Yet something important had changed. The idea of Kurdish nationhood had now entered the political world, and ideas, once born, are difficult to erase, even when borders are drawn, even when promises are broken, even when history turns in another direction, because identity does not vanish easily. It continues through memory, through language, through stories passed from one generation to the next, and in the decades ahead, that identity would face new challenges, new conflicts, new struggles. But it would also show remarkable resilience, because the Kurdish story was far from finished. In fact, one of its most difficult chapters was just beginning. The mountains were still there. Snow still covered the high peaks in winter. Spring still brought green grass to the valleys. Shepherds still guided their flocks across ancient paths. But the world around the Kurdish people had changed. After the First World War, the Kurdish homeland was no longer part of a single empire. Instead, it was divided between several new states: Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria. Each country had its own government, its own laws, its own political fears, and within each of these countries lived large Kurdish communities. For Kurdish families, daily life continued. Children were born. Markets opened each morning. Farmers worked their fields. But a new question slowly began to grow in many Kurdish minds. Where do we belong? In Turkey, the new republic under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk focused on building a strong national identity. The government promoted a unified Turkish language and culture. Many Kurdish traditions were discouraged or restricted. The Kurdish language was often limited in public life. Place names changed. Some Kurdish revolts occurred during the early decades of the republic. One of the most well-known was the Sheikh Said Rebellion in 1925. Sheikh Said was a religious leader who gathered support among Kurdish communities in eastern Anatolia. The rebellion spread across several regions, but the Turkish government responded with strong military force. The revolt was eventually suppressed. In the years that followed, Kurdish identity remained sensitive within the Turkish political system. Yet, despite pressure, Kurdish language and culture survived within families and communities. Stories were told at home. Songs were sung quietly. Traditions continued from parent to child. Meanwhile, in Iraq, the situation developed differently. After the First World War, Britain helped create the modern state of Iraq. Within this new country lived a large Kurdish population in the north. Some Kurdish leaders hoped to create an autonomous region. A well-known Kurdish leader during this time was Sheikh Mahmud Barzanji. He led several uprisings during the early 1920s. At one point, he even declared a Kurdish kingdom in the city of Sulaymaniyah. But British forces and the Iraqi government eventually defeated the rebellion. The dream of Kurdish independence once again faded, yet the idea never disappeared. Over the following decades, Kurdish political movements continued to grow. In the 1940s, an important moment appeared in Iranian Kurdistan. In 1946, Kurdish leaders briefly created a small state known as the Republic of Mahabad. It was supported for a short time by the Soviet Union. The Republic established Kurdish schools, Kurdish language newspapers, local government institutions. For the first time in modern history, a Kurdish state officially existed. But the moment was short. When Soviet forces withdrew from Iran, the Iranian government quickly regained control. The Republic of Mahabad lasted less than 1 year. Its leaders were arrested. Some were executed. Yet even this brief moment left a deep mark on Kurdish history because it proved that Kurdish political organization was possible. The dream still lived. Throughout the later 20th century, Kurdish political movements appeared in several countries. In Iraq, the Kurdish Democratic Party emerged under the leadership of Mustafa Barzani. Barzani became one of the most important Kurdish leaders of the century. For years, he negotiated with the Iraqi government while also leading armed resistance during times of conflict. The Kurdish struggle in Iraq became one of the longest political conflicts in the Middle East. Periods of negotiation alternated with periods of war, yet Kurdish culture continued to grow. Poetry, music, literature, radio broadcasts in Kurdish language. Across villages and cities, people preserve their identity. Because identity does not only live in politics, it lives in everyday life, in weddings filled with music and dancing, in colorful traditional clothing, in grandparents telling children stories about the mountains and their ancestors. Across Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria, Kurdish communities continued their lives. Some faced hardship. Some experienced limited cultural freedoms. Some built new political movements. The story was complex, different in each country. Yet one theme connected them all. Resilience, the quiet determination to remain who they were. The world outside often saw only conflict, but inside Kurdish homes another story was unfolding, a story of language passed between generations, of songs remembered, of identity carried forward, like a small flame protected from the wind. And as the 20th century moved toward its end, new changes were coming again, because the world itself was entering a new era. Old alliances were shifting, new political realities were forming, and the Kurdish story was about to enter another chapter. Close your eyes again for a moment, my friends. Imagine the same mountains we visited before. The wind still moves across the high ridges. Snow still melts slowly in the spring. Villages still rest quietly between the valleys. But something new is happening. The world around these mountains is changing faster than ever. The late 20th century was a time of deep transformation across the Middle East. Old political systems were shifting. New generations were growing up. Technology began connecting distant communities. And Kurdish voices were slowly becoming more visible to the wider world. For many decades, Kurdish political movements had struggled in difficult conditions. But by the end of the 20th century, some major changes began to appear. One of the most important developments happened in northern Iraq. After the Gulf War in 1991, a dramatic moment occurred. Following conflict between Iraq and an international coalition, large Kurdish populations in northern Iraq fled toward the mountains, fearing violence. Hundreds of thousands of civilians moved toward the borders. The world watched these images with shock. Refugee camps appeared across the mountains. Humanitarian crises spread quickly. In response, international forces created a protected zone in northern Iraq. This region became known as a no-fly zone. It prevented Iraqi government aircraft from operating in the area. For Kurdish communities in northern Iraq, this protection created something unexpected, a space for self-government. During the 1990s, Kurdish political parties in Iraq began building local institutions. They created a regional parliament, local administrative systems, schools teaching Kurdish language. Universities began expanding. Cities like Erbil and Sulaymaniyah slowly transformed. Markets grew larger. New roads connected towns. Cultural life flourished. For the first time in modern history, a large Kurdish region was able to govern itself with significant autonomy. This development became even more formal in 2005. After the fall of Saddam Hussein's government, the new Iraqi constitution officially recognized the Kurdistan region of Iraq as an autonomous federal region. Erbil became the capital of this region. Kurdish became an official language alongside Arabic. Regional institutions gained international attention. Foreign visitors began arriving. Universities welcomed students from many countries. Cultural festivals celebrated Kurdish heritage. Music, literature, and film began reaching global audiences. But Kurdish history was still complex. While Iraqi Kurdistan experienced increasing autonomy, Kurdish communities in other countries continued facing different political realities. In Turkey, Kurdish culture and political movements remained an important national issue. Over time, discussions about cultural rights, language, and political participation continued evolving. Kurdish music, television, and literature slowly became more visible. Artists and writers helped share Kurdish identity with wider audiences. In Syria, Kurdish communities in the north experienced dramatic change during the Syrian civil war that began in 2011. As central government control weakened in some regions, Kurdish groups organized local administrations in parts of northern Syria. New governing structures appeared. Local councils, community defense forces, schools teaching Kurdish language. These developments attracted global attention. Some observers saw them as experiments in local self-government. Others viewed them through the complex politics of the region. But for many Kurdish families living there, daily life still centered on ordinary hopes: safety, education, stability. Across Iran, Kurdish communities continued maintaining strong cultural traditions: poetry, music, language, family gatherings. Even when political systems were complicated, Kurdish identity continued to live through everyday life. And slowly, something else was happening. The Kurdish story was reaching the world. Writers published novels about Kurdish history and identity. Journalists reported from Kurdish cities. Musicians blended traditional Kurdish sounds with modern styles. Films told stories about mountain villages and historical struggles. Social media allowed Kurdish communities across different countries to communicate more easily. For centuries, Kurdish communities had often been separated by borders. Now technology created new connections. A student in Europe could listen to Kurdish music from Erbil. A writer in Diyarbakir could share poetry with readers across the world. The Kurdish story was no longer only a regional story. It had become a global conversation. And yet, the deeper heart of that story remained the same: mountains. Memory. Resilience. The mountains had watched thousands of years pass. Empires came and disappeared. Borders changed again and again. But the people of the mountains continued telling their story. Not always loudly, often quietly, but always persistently. Because identity, my friends, is not easily erased. It lives in language. It lives in songs. It lives in the memories parents share with their children. And as the 21st century continues unfolding, the Kurdish story continues with it. Still unfinished, still evolving, still carried forward by millions of voices. And now, my friends, we come to the final reflection of this long journey, because every long story leaves us with a deeper question: what does it mean to endure? The night is quiet again, my friends. Imagine we are still standing in those mountains. The air is cool. The sky is deep and full of stars. Somewhere far away, a small village light shines in the darkness. The mountains have watched thousands of years pass. They have seen empires rise with great power. They have seen kings build cities of stone. They have seen armies march across valleys with banners and drums. And they have seen those same empires disappear. Stone ruins remain, broken walls, forgotten roads. But the mountains remain. And among those mountains, the Kurdish people remain too. Their story was never simple. They did not build one great empire that historians could easily describe. They did not control a single powerful kingdom that lasted for centuries. Instead, their story moved through many different worlds: Persian empires, Greek kingdoms, Roman frontiers, Islamic dynasties, Ottoman rule, modern nation-states. Through every age, the Kurdish people adapted. Sometimes they served powerful rulers, sometimes they resisted them, sometimes they negotiated carefully between stronger neighbors, and sometimes they simply survived. Because survival itself can be a form of strength. Close your eyes again for a moment. Imagine a Kurdish grandmother sitting beside a fire in a mountain village. Snow falls softly outside the stone house. A child sits beside her. The child asks about the past, and the grandmother begins telling a story. She tells about the mountains. She tells about ancestors who walked through valleys long ago. She tells about songs that were sung when the winters were long. These stories carry something important. They carry memory, and memory is stronger than borders. Maps can change, governments can rise and fall, but memory travels quietly through generations. A language spoken at home. A traditional dance during a wedding celebration. A melody played on a simple instrument. These small moments keep identity alive. Across the Kurdish world today, millions of people share this memory. Some live in the cities of Diyarbakir or Van. Some live in the hills of Iraqi Kurdistan. Some live in villages in Iran. Others have moved far away, Europe, America, Australia. Yet when they hear Kurdish music, something familiar awakens. When they hear the language spoken, it feels like returning home. Because identity does not always live inside borders. Sometimes it lives inside people. In the 21st century, Kurdish culture continues evolving. Universities teach Kurdish literature. Young musicians mix traditional sounds with modern music. Writers publish novels that tell stories about mountain villages and modern cities. Films explore the experiences of Kurdish families across different countries. New generations are growing up in a global world. They use technology to connect across continents. They share language, stories, and culture through screens and voices that travel across oceans. But even as the world becomes more modern, the mountains still stand. They remind people where their story began. The mountains are patient teachers. They teach endurance. They teach balance. They teach that storms may come, but the stone beneath remains strong. Perhaps this is the deeper meaning of the Kurdish story, not simply a story about politics, not only a story about borders, but a story about resilience, the quiet ability of a people to remain themselves across centuries of change, a people who carried their identity through empires, wars, and shifting maps, a people who kept their language alive in songs and stories. And perhaps that lesson speaks to all of us, because every human being carries a kind of inner mountain, a place inside where memory lives, a place where identity remains strong even when the outside world changes. History often celebrates great kings and famous battles, but sometimes the most powerful stories belong to ordinary people, families who pass down traditions, communities who protect their language, individuals who remember where they came from. The Kurdish story reminds us of something simple and profound. A people can survive without a state, but no people can survive without memory. And memory, my friends, is something we all share. So tonight, as the wind moves softly across those ancient mountains, the Kurdish story continues, still unfolding, still carried forward by millions of voices, still alive in songs, language, and quiet resilience. Thank you for sitting with me beside the fire tonight. Until next time, my friends, sleep well.